Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Amazing to have my two fellow founding members of the Trending in Education squad. Yeah, I'll call it a squad. I'm rejoined today by Brandon Jones and Dan Strafford. Welcome back to Trending in Education.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here. Feels like it's been both a matter of years and a matter of moments. Good to be back with both you guys.
Absolutely. And Dan, I know we had you back on with Melissa a little bit recently, and you've been kind of a semi-regular really throughout. I'm not making a joke. It's not a judgment. Sporadic.
Right.
You're a contributor. You're around. You've been
Yeah.
in our universe, but you're getting back into our universe. You were the guy who really got us off the ground way back in 2016.
Yeah, I'll say I'm trending in ed adjacent. So
Mm,
appreciate being part of the universe. And yeah, crazy to think we were talking before we started recording. You're nearing 600 episodes in the not too
yeah.
distant future. That is a crazy high number. We talked about pod fading a lot back
Mm.
when we first started, and the idea of starting something and then it just disappearing. Pretty incredible to see a lasting legacy from our working together days. Now all of us in three other ventures, but still getting back together.
That's right. We were a part of the Kaplan mothership. We were kind of like the P-Funk of the Kaplan mothership is the way I kind of thought about it. But yeah, we've now emerged. I'm going to shift metaphors. We've emerged from the chrysalis. We've all bloomed as caterpillars. We're all now wonderful butterflies. But Brandon, what you been up to? Like you've been on since you left and we were talking about behavioral health. Can you catch folks up on what you've been up to?
Yeah, thanks. Still up to a lot of the same, or at least at the same place as I was when last I was on the show. So I'm at Triad, and Triad is, there's three prongs of the Triad. So it's an education, community, and career, but specifically dedicated to behavioral and mental health, supporting students, professionals, organizations. I have been there since I left Kaplan back in 2019. We're doing really cool things there. Behavioral health is a really important space to me personally and has been really rewarding professionally. I'm doing enough of what I was doing before, and as much as we have an education component, both exam prep and continuing education,
Right.
but doing it in a new space, that is, again, really important. It's important to the world. It's increasingly important. Basically, something approaching all of us need some support now,
Right.
and I'm thrilled to be there. So happy to share
Yeah.
more as we get into the
Sure.
show today.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as opposed to pod fading, I like to think of it as pod thriving. And you're
Thriving.
helping folks thrive. And I do happen to know that there is a thriving podcast that's been live, I think, since 2020, if I remember right.
Yeah, that's right. We launched our first episode on April 20th, 2020. And just a quick plug, I'll do a couple of these, shamelessly so, but for Behavioral Health Today. So find Behavioral Health Today wherever you get your podcasts. We are now up over 200,000 downloads, which is exciting. We've crossed the 200 episode mark. Hosted by Graham Taylor, who is a psychologist with 30 years of clinical experience in both hospitals and private practice settings. We've also expanded to two other hosts, Dr. Aaron Elmore, and we've got a new host, Charlotte Dixon, coming on as a social worker. We've had U.S. senators come on the show. We had the guy who hosted the Aaron Rodgers Darkness Retreat. He was one of our recent guests.
You had me at ayahuasca.
We covered the gamut. There's a lot of ways to do behavioral health, so to speak, and we cover across the board. And then also a thank you to you, Mike. I know I thanked you before offline. You helped us launch this show that, 3 years later is still thriving. So appreciate that. And it's become a really good thought leadership vehicle for us, and excited to see that pod also continue to flourish.
Absolutely. That is kind of in the DNA of this show, which was really started in that way for Kaplan. Like how do we engage the rest of the world? And, increasingly people are exploring new media formats. And, back in the day, we weren't video. Now we're video. Isn't that exciting, guys? This is video. I mean, it's exciting for us. Imagine for our viewers. Although listening still has its advantages. I'm all about the learn holes. I'm an ear reader. I like to get the information in there. You can speed it up, although actually you can speed up video. It just looks a little weird. But yeah, the technology keeps moving forward. The other technology that's out there that we talked about, I was listening as prep. I was listening to the first episode in our feed where, interestingly, the first 30 episodes are now the quote unquote lost episodes. So there are 30 episodes of Trending in Ed from back in 2016 into spring of 2017 that are currently missing. If you've seen them, let me know. The Amber Alert should be going out right now. We're missing 30 episodes of Trending and Ed. But then the 31st episode, the first episode that's in the feed, is our March Madness conversation going into the bracketology going into the 2017 March Madness brackets. And, at the time, the number one seed, the overdog that we were talking about, was artificial intelligence.
Right.
The number 16 seed, I think it was mindful learning, which full circle kind of comes back to some of the stuff you're doing now, Brandon, around behavioral health, being mindful, thinking about self care. But then AI is the other massive theme that we talked about a ton. We probably talked about it so much back in 16, 17, 18 that people were like, God, these guys are talking about AI again. And then it happened. So
And then
then
it sure did.
yeah, within the last year, it really has happened. We're going to bring Nancy in to get her perspective in a little bit. This is the Just Us Humans part of the show. But just as us humans, you know, what's it been like for each of you? The year of AI, which is really, we're coming up on a year since ChatGPT 3.5 hit the scene right around Turkey Day last year. What's it been like for each of you trying to wrap your head around that trend?
I'll add some things, and I know, Dan, I want to hear your perspective too. It's all AI all the time, honestly, and it's not like a throwaway or a glib comment. It's here and it is used in production. I'll share a little bit later in the show about how it's being used in production at Triad today.
Mm,
But, everything from the adoption of ChatGPT specifically. So the number of months it took to get to 100 million users
yeah,
for Instagram was 30 months. For TikTok is 9 months. For ChatGPT was 2 months. 2
right,
months
right,
from its launch to get to 100 million
right.
monthly users.
I think a lot of that was attributed to my episode with Nancy.
I assume so. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
that's probably at least 60 or 70 million of those users came out of that show.
yeah,
I do think a thing, and this is a hot take, but as an early user of ChatGPT, I was in the first few days once
yeah,
people started using it. I really found the interface was just incredible. Like the fact that
hmm,
it would respond, like you see the cursor on the screen, it would respond about as fast as a human can read,
yeah,
as opposed to, for example, something it also could have just as easily done, and that you know other AI technologies have been doing is just producing blocks of text at a
right.
time. It made it feel conversational in a way that I think I had never really experienced before, and
Hmm,
so I think that was maybe an underappreciated part of how it caught fire. It was AI, but built for humans. It felt like
yeah.
the human interface of being able to send us information about the speed that we could read was really purpose built for us.
We had our
And
dance
it's
partner. We had Ginger Rogers to our Fred Astaire.
That's right. The backwards and the heels version of what we were
Yep.
doing was really incredible to see. So a lot more thoughts on AI. You asked us in prep for this episode, what new hotness has been capturing our attention? I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know how it could be anything other than AI. I have a handful of things I want to share, but Dan, I want to make sure to
yeah.
hear from you too. How have you been using ChatGPT and other AI tools?
So it is a fascinating time to be a media producer when it comes to AI because you see things like Photoshop and Lightroom and even now After Effects and Premiere Pro, these are all part of the Adobe Creative Cloud, are starting to use generative AI as part of their process and they sort of
Right.
make suggestions along the way. There's just a video shared, I want to say from Adobe, from one of their sort of in-person events where they were able to generate a brand new suit on an actor and actually make it move.
Hmm.
And it looked fine. It looked legitimately like something that happened in real time.
Did they use Smart Dust
Uh,
to
th-
make that happen?
It's possible. I think that's
Okay.
patent pending, but that's a game changer for a multimedia producer, right? If I can not even really worry about the shot I'm taking and still get the shot I wanted, it does also put a lot of people out of work. That's been a
Mm,
discussion around this. A director no longer needs to be there to worry about a shot if it's capturing the general sense of it. Writers, we've seen the writer's strike come to a conclusion. I've been using ChatGPT for work simply to start my research. The idea of, hey, write me a script on this, and I'm
right.
gonna read it. Here's what I need to change for our brand, for what we're
Hmm.
doing. And then personally, I've used it similarly with daughter's homework or with things that I need to better understand quickly to get there. I've played around with Midjourney and the other sort of generative AI
Hmm.
imagery. I find this the interesting sort of cross section of this all is I don't know if you saw Microsoft AI, Bing generation generated an image with Mickey Mouse in it. I'm not going to go
Mm.
into details of it, but it had a very specific date and time in our history that was tough for a lot of people. The image itself is awful, but it's the idea that it's a pretty solid depiction of Mickey Mouse.
Yeah.
Disney has not released their, treasure
Right.
trove of data to Microsoft.
Hmm.
So how is this AI parsing data all
Yeah.
across the internet to piece together a really
Yeah.
convincing version of Mickey Mouse in this awful scenario?
Right. I mean, I heard a similar story about how they were training the AI just using English. And then suddenly the AI was able to speak Farsi. And the people who were training it didn't even understand how
How?
that happened. You know, it's pretty crazy. But yeah, I've had similar experiences just as a producer, as a maker. If you decide to ride that wave, there's some pretty good surfing to be had right now. You can
Right.
be more productive than it used to
Exactly.
take a lot more work to be super prolific. And
I am
now,
adopting.
yeah,
I've said this before. If it can help me do my job faster and better, I want to know how it works. Will I
right,
use it all the time? No. I have earlier in life been bullheaded and ignored trends and said, I'm going to do it my way and forget this technology. But I've learned, hey, learn it. Like, don't
right,
ignore it or don't sort of rage against it. See
right,
how it can help you, see how you need to adjust over time, and be the one on the trend, trending in education, be the one on the trend rather than the one trying to push against it.
right,
Because we've talked about the Gartner hype cycle. This stuff is coming. We've talked
yeah,
about it for years. We
right,
can't ignore it. And we can't say, I'm going to be better than it. I need to learn how to use it properly and make
right,
my life easier.
right. AI is not going to take your job. Somebody else using AI is going to take your job.
Exactly.
So you should probably use AI.
Yeah, and it's good. It's good to turn of phrase. I don't know if it's good that your job is going to be taken, but another turn of phrase that I've been hearing lately, not mine, but one that I like, is augmented intelligence,
Yep.
which is confusingly also called AI. You would
Mhm.
think that maybe you could have done something different, aug.
Speaking of AI, I just saw Allen Iverson and Shaq are getting
Yeah.
involved with Reebok. So AI talking about practice.
Yeah, talking about talking about the game.
That AI. And interesting, you need to practice with AI to get good with it. But
That's
anyway,
right.
shout out to AI. But yes,
Yeah.
we're not talking Allen Iverson. You're talking augmented intelligence.
Augmented intelligence. This is a term of art that is used and has been used for a couple of years by the AMA, American Medical Association. One of the early uses of AI pre-ChatGPT in the medical field is in radiology. Thinking about what computers can do just much better than humans, and
Yep.
processing images, for example, is one of those things that it's just very clearly something that machines can do better. But there is still human insight that is needed. And so one of the things that the AMA heard from radiologists, MDs who were trained in this field, is that they were feeling both sort of threatened by and maybe sort of marginalized by AI. And I think honestly, in another demonstration, the power of language, the AMA changed the way it talks about AI use in radiology to make it augmented intelligence.
Yeah.
It emphasizes human intelligence rather than replaces it. In my field, just as a quick note, the behavioral health equivalent of images in radiology is talk and speech to text. There's just more when you think about a core. It's not true of all therapy, but in a lot of therapy, like the core medium is talk therapy.
Right.
Hmm.
And so there are just so many more words to process than any
Yeah.
human practically could process, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so machines are just going to be better at that. But I don't think that today, anyway, they're going to have the nuance and the training, really the specific training to extract insights from that, or put those extractable insights from that large data set analysis into practice.
Hmm.
And that's where I think augmented intelligence is also applicable in behavioral health. And
Right.
so, I'm not sure another kind of AI is actually going to catch on in the parlance of our times, but I do
Right.
think that the spirit of that, a human who is using AI expertly in terms of prompt engineering, in terms of using tooling that's available to her, is
Hmm.
going to be better than a human that doesn't. I really
Right.
do believe that. It's not John Henry versus the steam engine. It's John Henry using the steam engine.
Right. Ride that engine,
I
cowboy. Let's
love it. I
go.
love it. To your point, in getting ready for this episode, I was Googling any number of things and trying to figure out connections. And I did see an article on today.com about a mother who was dealing with a son who had tons of medical issues, but no doctor could diagnose.
Mm.
17 different doctors not diagnosing. She
Mhm.
typed the symptoms into ChatGPT. ChatGPT spit out a potential diagnosis. She went on a Facebook group, posted a doctor there, diagnosed, brought it back. That's spina bifida. That's what the
Right.
child had. And so to
Mhm.
your point, the old garbage in, garbage out, data you're putting in, data you're putting out. But I do think you nailed it, Brandon, of augmenting what we do, bringing the human intelligence. What do I want out of this? How do I get this interface to give me what I want or what I need? And then the computer's getting better and better at parsing that data and figuring out what it is we want and what we need. I mean, I love it in behavioral health. I do therapy every 2 weeks, 45 minutes, virtual. I get distracted. My therapist gets distracted. Is there a cycle of recording that can spit out trends, spit out what I might
Yeah.
need more focus on? What am I
Yeah.
saying even subconsciously or that I don't even recognize?
Those tools exist
Yeah.
today, which is exciting. And they didn't exist like yesterday. I mean, yesterday, yes, but like, metaphorical yesterday, they didn't, where it's sentiment analysis. It's not just processing the words, it's actually listening for tone.
Wow.
Mhm.
And, there are, I hope this is not true of you, Dan, but there are people who are in therapy, obviously, who are like at very acute risk for very acute outcomes, and being
100%.
able to identify,
Mhm.
not just in what is being said, but how it's being said, being able to say, okay, of your patient census, this 5% you really need to, direct to more critical care. Honestly, I think it's going to save lives. I think it's
Yeah.
going to change lives.
Mhm.
And, when you think even about the 45-minute session that you mentioned, like how many words
Right.
are said in that
I
45-minute
talk a
session? There's
lot.
just right. And well, that's what you're there for.
Right.
That's the
Right.
therapeutic part of it, right? That's why talk therapy works, is getting you talking. Talk therapy doesn't work if it's just silence, right? And
Right.
Right.
so,
Right.
that becomes a giant body of, we think about not just those, but all of the talk therapy sessions happening all across the United States,
Yeah.
the world, but especially the United States. I've got a fact later here in a second, but it's just a huge corpus of data essentially that no
Right.
human can really process. And
Right.
excited to apply humans to it. Just the one thing that I heard, and this is a pretty sobering fact, there are more psychologists in New England than there are in Africa.
Mm.
And I think that's, there's some established versus emerging country dynamic there. Obviously, Africa is a continent, not a country, but you know what I'm saying? There's
Yep.
also a focus on mental health in the US that, as short as we are on mental health professionals, we are, relative to the world, long on awareness that mental health is part of human health.
And that's very much been on the upswing, the last 3 years plus, pandemic followed by, Black Lives Matter and social consciousness being raised, and the pandemic stretching on to the point where we're all under stress, and then, the problem we have, just the civility problem that we have nowadays, and the fact that people just maybe coming out of the pandemic and just under more stress, people just don't know how to get along and how to be comfortable with one another. Like that's why the timing of your move to behavioral health, Brandon, is really interesting, because like it does feel like external factors really transform that industry probably as much as any, and it's actually a place where, you know, I'm looking mostly at education, but we're always looking for adjacencies. And it does feel like, frequently we talk about gaming and media as adjacencies, but behavioral health is a really interesting one when you do think about education. Haven't done this in a while, but I get social emotional, baby.
Yeah,
I
sing it
kind
for
of
me, baby.
blended it. I blended it a little bit into some kind of Barry White flow. But you know what I mean? Like that's something we were talking about back in the day. The other thing we talked about is this blending, this augmentation. We talked about centaurs
Yep.
and blending human intelligence with AI. And then also the uncanny valley, that when AI gets it wrong, still, it's because it's just socially awkward, or it kind of misses the subtlety, the nuance, the intangibles that are
Absolutely.
more about what it is to be human. We're going to bring Nancy in a bit, but is there any just us humans part of the conversation? Other items?
I
Yeah.
got a couple things to add just on the uncanny valley piece. I found in video, it's still tough. So we've used Synthesia, which,
Hmm.
not to give them a plug, but I think it's a good service. But it's good for videos that are short, meaning like 2 minutes or less.
Synesthesia is like virtual humans, right? Like you can
Yeah.
create
So
video based on a script, or yeah.
right. And so what we're doing, we're hooking up AI tools to AI tools. So we're using ChatGPT to write scripts
Yep.
and then feeding those scripts into Synthesia.
Hmm.
which then produces, digital video avatars and
Right.
voices. So you can
Yep.
select your avatar, you can select her voice or his voice. And it's quite good. It's not quite out of the uncanny valley. My experience, this is from an N of one, but my experience is you can watch that for a couple minutes, but we have a lot of continuing education courses, which are
Mhm.
required by boards to be no less than 1 hour. That's like
Yeah.
sort of the atomic unit in some cases. I don't think it's watchable for an hour.
Right.
Mhm.
That may be different by the time someone is listening to this very episode in the future. Like when you're listening to it, we may already be using it. It may already be out of the uncanny valley, but in 2023 today, I don't think it quite is.
Uncanny Valley, if folks don't know what it is.
You may do a better job of this, but essentially there is on a curve of obviously machine to obviously human, there is a progression where, it's how humans react to machines that are like, it's Turing test related. Like, can you tell that this is a machine or not? And machines do well when they are obviously machines and do well from human perspective. And they do well when they're obviously humans, which is hard to get to. In the middle, there is this uncanny valley where they start to look like humans. They start to resemble, whether it's, in how they appear or how they interact with you, but you kind of can tell that they're not. And so like the hairs on the back of your neck go up a little and you're like, that's
It's uncanny, and we're not talking X-Men.
right.
Wish we were.
Exactly. And that's where, honestly, I think we've gotten deeper into the uncanny valley, but we're not quite out of it yet. Specifically in video, I think that there
Yeah.
are chatbots that I think probably do pass the Turing test, probably do feel human, that in fact are machines. We actually had an experience where it went the other way. There was a woman on my team who finally met one of the clients that we've been working with, and that person was surprised to find out that she was a human
Yeah.
because of how professional and responsive her communication was. And I thought that was mostly a compliment, I think.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take it as a compliment, but
Right.
interesting to see it go the other way.
You got the personality of a chatbot. I mean,
Right, yeah. She's a lovely woman, honestly. So, again, I think credit to her and her professionalism.
If I remember right, we did do an episode about a second Uncanny Valley, which is kind of what you're describing. Because I remember we were talking about like telemarketers
Yes. Yep.
and
Mm,
how like if you speak so much from a script that
You
you
become a
don't seem human, that actually is uncanny to the human perceiver too, where you're like, dude, throw me a bone. Just get off your script. Give me
yeah.
something, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting. We have these, these OSs hard-coded, hardwired into us that we, without really thinking about it, this is the sort of uncanny part of it. In both of those values you described, like you kind of know,
Yeah.
right? You don't have to say, we don't have a checklist to say, a human does the following 150 things, but it's just there. It's like just written into all of us. We can tell when something is human, when something isn't.
Yeah. Our intuition is real. It's also embodied, So it is interesting to sort of look at the arms race around intelligences and increasingly this idea of super intelligence, which is something we also had talked about. And, we talked about robot overlords and Elon Musk a lot back in 2016, 2017. We may have been a little more positive.
I was gonna
I've
say.
maybe soured a little bit. I was thinking of him as Tony Stark. He might be more like Doc Ock. Something that's very Marvel Cinematic Universe episode. You're welcome.
The
Yeah.
Elon Musk bit, it's just we've talked about Neuralink so many times. The trials are beginning or not beginning, but it was interesting to me. You brought up gamification and gaming education. I don't know if you saw. I think it was the Activision CEO was doing a talk back about AI, about all these different things, and he actually name dropped Elon Musk and Neuralink, saying that he believes there'll be games specifically created for brain implants
Right.
that are specifically tailored to trick your brain, for lack of better words, into believing this experience happened. And that is the acknowledgement therein is just a moment of, wait, can I know that it's not real? Like if
Right.
a chip is in my brain, is my
Mhm.
brain able to parse what is happening and
Mhm.
say, yes, this experience was real. No, this is coded and written to this chip. Like that's that next step we've been talking about so long
Yeah.
that it's just now being openly spoken about and openly
Right.
discussed as potential next steps of something like Neuralink.
And I think a lot depends on whether you took the ayahuasca I was talking about
Exactly right.
earlier, but that's a separate episode. Any other pieces from the two of you?
I have one thing while you're getting Nancy ready. I attended a presentation where the speaker, Danny Morrison, to give him credit because it was his work, was talking about the half-life of information in medical knowledge. So like, when carbon dating something, things have a half-life where half of in the information side, where half of it is no longer true.
Hmm.
And in 1950, that half-life was determined to be 50 years. So that 50 years later, half of what you learned in 1950 would no longer considered to be true.
Wow.
In 1980, it was 20 years. So in 1980, half the things 20 years later would no longer be true. In 2020, that number was down to 73 days. So, I think in a world where it's so VUCA, everything is happening so fast, there's so many changes. We'll talk about LLMs and the power of these large data sets, like it has all of human history in it. There's more data being generated, probably today than there was literally today than there was in, thousands of years of human history. We're going to need to find ways to stay current with things and stay current with things that are actually believed to be true. And so I do think that augmented intelligence piece is even more important in a world where that half-life of information is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. When you think about your therapist or your doctor, when she went to grad school or med school 15 years ago, it's probably true that something like most of what she learned is no longer believed to be true.
You just broke my brain a little bit, Brandon, because thinking about like lawyers are trained to read, right? Lawyers are trained to go to the books and find the law. And so 73 days is just
Right.
We probably need to dig into that number, but it's getting really fast is the point.
Right.
Because like there's some bodies of knowledge that I think are probably a little more resilient that are not
Sure, of
being
course.
turned upside down. But then
Right.
there's
So
other
like case law until cases
yeah,
overturned.
but I think a lot of like
lawyers.
skills development and things that used to be a best practice, there's that old saw that I like, best practices are for amateurs. It's almost like by the time you learn a best practice, by the time you learn a best practice, it's probably
Right.
outdated, so
Right.
there
That
is
73-day date was specifically in the medical field.
got it.
Right? But like when you think about it,
Wow.
in what field do we as humans most want the most current things to be applied? Right.
Right. It's also where, I mean, on a positive note, you referenced this, Brandon, it's where we've probably seen the most meaningful breakthroughs have been around using AI. Even, protein folding is the one I keep coming back to, where like there are technological breakthroughs that are powered by AI and humans. This is another example of that blend where like humans are using these tools, but I'm likening it to the opposite of war games. The only way to lose is not to play, you know. But yeah, let me here's Nancy. So we'll see how much of this we actually use. This is what Nancy's going to say at the beginning of the show.
Welcome to Trending in Education, the podcast that humans have been running for many years. I'm Nancy, your virtual co-host, happy to be here and taking things one day at a time. I'm just hoping to find opportunities to contribute to the squad.
Be sure to subscribe to the Trending in Ed feed to get the latest from Nancy, with Nancy interviewing a little bit of Dan and Brandon while we have them. And then I have the opportunity to get some quality one-on-one time with Nancy, which interestingly is probably the most frequently requested and or commented upon aspect of this podcast. So be on the lookout for more Nancy-centered shows. Talk about the uncanny valley, talk about all that's happening in AI and education these days. Nancy's show coming soon to a Trending in Ed feed near you. We're going to wrap up here with Just Us Humans, getting a little more from Brandon and Dan for today's episode, and be on the lookout for more like this, both with old school humans and with what's now our old school virtual co-host, Nancy. Subscribe to Trending in Ed wherever it gets your podcasts. Also, check us out now on YouTube. With that, we'll pick up here with Brandon and Dan's final thoughts as we wrap up this episode of Trending in Ed.
I know that you and Dan and Melissa recently covered the Gartner Hype Cycle. One thing I wanted to mention, I did a little deep dive into the Gartner Hype Cycle over the last 7 years, the time of this podcast.
Yeah.
And a thing that I was interested to see is how the Gartner Hype Cycle has changed, not even calling out specific trends and where they appear year to year, but the Gartner Hype Cycle has, of course, passed the
It's
peak
been
of
on
inflated.
its own meta.
It
Yeah.
has. Did you talk about this?
No, I just said it now. That was the first
There
time.
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. So, past the peak of inflated expectations, there's the trough of disillusionment, the slope of enlightenment, and the plateau of productivity curves. What's interesting when you look back in 2017 and then play it forward, there's less and less that the Gartner Hype Cycle is putting past the peak of inflated expectations. Like the actual in 2023, There were 0 things that were to the right of the graph
Right.
beyond the peak.
Right. You're about to go on the roller coaster. It's the most exciting part. Yeah.
And nothing else is there. And so in 2017, there were 7 trends that were beyond the peak. There were 4 that were in the trough, and there was 1 that was in the slope of enlightenment. And it's gone from 7, 4, and 1 to 4 and 5 and 0 to 2 and 3 and 0 to 1 and 3 and 0 to now 0. There's
Yeah.
0. And so I think as a meta trend, I wonder if that speaks to whether it's the people at Gartner or
Yep.
humans today. We just care about the new cool
Hotness.
shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's maybe a less good interpretation of that, right? In terms of our ability to not just appreciate intuitiveness, but stick to itiveness as well.
Mhm.
So as a future episode, Mike, I would love to come back with you and Dan and
Yeah.
talk about, actually do some of those trend mapping.
Yeah.
And then we talked about what things I think we got right and wrong back in the day.
Yeah.
So I think what we got right, we got right some trend spotting things like the Gartner hype cycle, like Hull and IQ. I think we were early to talk about those. I
Yep.
think we also had some great guests on the show, people who had really interesting stories to tell and expertise to share. And then I think, not to get like too maudlin about this, but our dynamic, I think the 3 of us work well together. Dan, you made this happen. I wouldn't have done this without you. So I appreciate that you introduced me to being a podcast host, and I brought that to the place I am at now. We had fun. I think the things like Dan's trivia questions with some ding. I think the lists, I love a list. I think
Yeah.
bracketology you mentioned at the top. So I think those are all good. I think things that, we could have done better is, for me personally, I wish that I had more time to prep some of the topics. I went deep on some things and pretty
Yeah.
shallow on some others. And, like being kind to myself. We all were doing it as,
Yeah.
in between and betwixt the day job, right?
Yeah.
So, but
And we cranked out some content. Our cadence was pretty good. We were doing
it
an
was good.
episode
Yeah.
1 or more a week. Yeah.
1 more a week was great. I wish that we had gotten started a couple years earlier. Like when I think about it,
Sure.
Dan and Mike, we were all talking about this. I give us credit for doing it, but had we done it even earlier, like I'm not sure if we'd be Joe Rogan, but we might have gotten even earlier adoption, might mean even more listeners.
Yeah.
And then finally, I wish that maybe we'd done a little bit more proprietary tracking of things, like a meta layer that sits on
Mhm.
top of Gartner or Hull and IQ or Rohit, non-obvious trends. We did really good work. And I think that there is that sort of meta layering that we could have put a wrapper around, and even more than we did.
Mhm.
And then, things that we're most optimistic about and things that folks should steer clear of. I mentioned this at the top, I am most optimistic about the transformative power of AI and really being augmented intelligence. I think that there are obviously risks. There will be disruption to industries and jobs. And, Dan had mentioned earlier in the show, things like deepfakes and how it can be used for ill. I don't want to hand wave that, semicolon. But I also think that the net impact of AI is going to be really positive. Just
Right.
processing large data sets that humans simply can't is going to make things better for humans, including humans in specialized fields like behavioral health.
Mhm.
And then I think this thing to steer clear of, maybe it's Pollyannish to think that we could, but the doom scrolling and divisiveness, obviously we are in a moment in time when we're recording this where there are terrible things happening around the world. And we're heading into an election cycle in the US in 2024 that I think is going to be pretty fraught. So
Yeah.
I don't mean to stick our collective heads in the sand and just pretend away the things that are happening. But I think if you spend your time, which that is the one major limiting factor in the human condition is time. If you spend your time in a recursive loop about things being bad, I think it's hard to get out of that. And so I hope that we, in whatever brings us joy, whether that's our families or our friends or, our hobbies or whatever, I hope that while we're keeping an eye to the world and making the world a better place in whatever small way we can, we're also taking time for our wellness and our joy. That's
Yeah,
my message looking forward for all of us in some small way.
And just to build on that, we'll always have podcasting, right? We can listen to podcasts, we can record pods. It's like, I have a 4-year-old. He's almost done with his blankets, but not yet. It's like a comfortable blanket, and it's nice to dust off the old ones. This is keeping it real from back in the day. Brandon, amazing to have you. Dan, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for rejoining us.
Appreciate it, Mike. Pleasure to always chop it up and discuss things, gets my brain working on things I don't every day, which I appreciate, and keeps me up to speed on what's trending in education.
Awesome. Hopefully, our listeners enjoyed this as much as we did. If you did, please subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. Be on the lookout for us bringing some of the old school trending in ed classics back into your feed so that you get to hear some of the original awesome in addition to all the new hotness that we got going on. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.